Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I've set these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing. I don't know why I always trip over that word. Preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That is the first reason that I do these. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the sign text for the week. So that is why I do these. Side note, I noticed this morning that this particular episode of Sermon Braindump is episode number 196, which means I'm coming up on 200 of these that I have done over the course of the past few years. And that's kind of mind-blowing. I think I'm actually coming up on the 3-year anniversary roughly this summer. I think 3 years I've been doing it, maybe 4, maybe it's 4. I don't know. It's been a long time. Either way, I think that's kind of cool because this started as an experiment for a summer thing to do to help out my congregation. And now several years later and almost 200 episodes later, here we are still going at it. So kudos to any of you who have been here since the beginning. And if not, hey, thanks for being here anyway. This particular Sunday, after that tangent, April 15th, 2018. Hey, make sure you have your taxes done here in the U.S. because this weekend is like tax day. This is the weird. This is the third Sunday of Easter. We are still in the season of Easter, the celebration, which goes for 50 days before we hit the day of Pentecost coming up here towards the end of May. And so we're about halfway through that season, not quite halfway through, but getting close. Where we are continuing to have gospel texts that feature the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. That's kind of what we've been focusing on so far. And so because of that, what we'll read here in a moment may seem kind of familiar. We're in Luke this time around, that partially being because we're actually in the year of Mark, and since Mark features no post-resurrection appearances, it's kind of tricky to have them. But last week, we had the story usually called Doubting Thomas, which features 2 resurrection appearances of Jesus. One, the night of the resurrection, which is when Thomas is absent, and then a second one a week later, when the settings are pretty much the same. The main difference being that Thomas was not there and then Thomas is there. And Jesus comes and appears among them despite being in the locked room and tells them, hey, peace be with you, or peace to you. Then we hear about the doubt of Thomas, and the second one, Jesus says, look at my hands, feel my side, look and see that I am he and that I'm risen. And so we have that. This week, it's Luke's account that's pretty much the same story. Now, we don't have the passage of time like we had a week ago. We don't have Thomas singled out, but yet it's that same thing in that same sense. We will hear once again, peace to you, or peace be with you. We hear that some of them are doubting, which seems to be a common theme among the post-resurrection appearances. We hear about that in Matthew's account of the post-resurrection appearance as well, when the disciples encounter Jesus on top of the mountain for the Great Commission in Matthew 28, if you're familiar with that story. So definitely a very similar sense, a similar theme that is present this week as what we heard last week out of John. So some of my thoughts are still kind of the same. A word on timing here in Luke. So again, it's still the day of the resurrection. So Jesus is raised first thing in the morning, Sunday morning, appears to the, does he appear to the women? I don't remember if he appears to the women or not. I'm harmonizing the Gospels in my mind. Always dangerous to do. But there's the women do witness the empty tomb, and the angels are there telling them what's happened. So they run back and they tell the disciples. We hear that the disciples consider it to be an idle tale. They don't believe the women, even though Peter, in the very least, and maybe Peter and one other disciple, run off. I know it's just Peter here in Luke. Runs off and sees the empty tomb. So he's seen the empty tomb as well, but not Jesus. So then we have a little shift forward, and we have the road to Emmaus story that happens between the resurrection morning and then where we'll pick up here in a moment. and how Jesus is walking along the road to Emmaus with two disciples. We know one's named Cleopas. We don't know who the other person is, but and that he's with them, and they're discussing many things, and he's opening their minds to the scriptures. That's a theme that will come up too. We hear that again here in the passage, that Jesus opens the scriptures to them, and then finally in the breaking of the bread, once they've reached Emmaus, that's when they realize it's Jesus, and he disappears, and so they pick up. We hear that same hour they ran back to Jerusalem and found the disciples. And they're jabbering, and in that exchange between these two and the rest of the disciples, we hear that Jesus is risen, that he's appeared to, at some point through the day, he's appeared to Peter. We don't know when. We don't have that story. I would love to have that story, but we don't have that story. And that now as they're jabbering about these, and the two tell them what had happened on the road in Emmaus. And so it's in this exchange where finally we pick up. Gosh, I've been talking for 6 minutes and I haven't even started the text yet, but that's where things pick up. So it's still the night after the resurrection. Now, we don't know exactly what time it is. We know that they reached Emmaus, which is like 8 or 9 miles away from Jerusalem. They reached that at evening. So by the time they have run back to Jerusalem and found the disciples, it's, who knows what time. It could be middle of the night. It could be pushing the next morning. But regardless, it's all happening that same day or within a very short, probably I would estimate that this is within 24 hours of the resurrection. So it's still Easter Sunday, if we want to say that. Okay. All of that being said, that's what's happening. That exchange is going on. And let's pick up in Luke 24, verse 36b through 48. Jesus himself stood among them, among the disciples, and said to them, "Peace be with you." There's that phrase again. First thing he says. They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet and see that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. I'm going to pause. I like how that's translated. It doesn't say doubt here, but disbelieving, and that is accurate. The Greek word for to believe is pistis or pistos, and this is apistos, which is like I don't know, atypical. It's so anti. So don't be anti-believing, but believe. Okay. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. Remember I said that before. And he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." Okay, so I have several different thoughts that I'll try and shove through. A lot of what happens here seems to be Jesus recapping. Remember what we said before. Remember what was written. Remember. So we hear the same theme again, where he opens their minds to understand the scriptures, and like I said, he did the very same thing on the road to Emmaus with the two disciples. We hear him say or explain how Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, is it the Psalms? Must be fulfilled, so that this is not something unexpected, although it is unexpected, but that this has been foretold in the what we would call the Old Testament scriptures and the Torah, that's in there. So there's that idea of think back. When he starts talking about repentance and forgiveness of sins will be proclaimed to all nations, that seems very reminiscent of John's message way back when. The idea of repentance, of turning away, metanoia, I think, if memory serves me correctly, is the Greek word on that. Don't quote me on that one. Some Greek I remember really well. Others I'm like, yeah, I think that's what it is. But that all of this has happened. That there's a new message that needs to be taken out, although it seems to be really reminiscent of what John started clear back in the beginning of the gospel. But that you are witnesses of these things. And that's kind of how this ends. And um, some other thoughts too, and I want to kind of throw that out. You're witnesses of this. You've seen this yourselves, so be prepared to talk about it. Jesus makes a pretty big show of showing the disciples that he is alive again, that he's not a ghost. He says, "See my hands and feet. Do you have anything to eat?" I was reading in a commentary that speculated that talked or referenced a very, very early church historian, like second century church historian, who talked about this is a way to prove that you're not a ghost. Apparently, this was an issue at the time, to show the bones in your hands and feet, because spirits don't have bones. And what's the boniest part of your body? It's your hands and your feet. So that's one, to show I have bones. I'm not a ghost. To eat is another one. And apparently there was a couple other ones too that are escaping me this morning as I'm recording this, but there were other things too. So is that what Jesus is doing? Is Jesus proving to them that he is alive again, even though they have witnessed him dead? Is that what's happening here? And as I think about that, my brain goes in a direction that is perhaps a bit of a stretch for this text, but since there's so much of similarities to what we saw last week in John, yes, there are differences, but there are still a lot of similarities, and the theme itself seems to be the same. I'm kind of trying to find something different in it. And so in my mind, I'm kind of focusing in on that, this evidence that Jesus is alive, that the divine will, how do I say this? That the divine is found in the finite. I remember back to my seminary days, we always talk about the infinite, that God is infinite. It's beyond us, but the infinite will be found in the finite. And that the fact that Jesus has been raised from the dead is something unexpected, perhaps otherworldly, we might say that. That's perhaps why the disciples were so freaked out, because there's no coming back from death. Logic tells us that, and yet God is doing something new through Jesus, and doing it through the finite, through the flesh, through the human, this is taking place. And that I think that's interesting, and that's a good reminder for us that oftentimes, particularly in Lutheran theology, and I'm going to maybe critique Lutheran theology just a little bit here, we often go to the broken, we go to the flawed, we go to the sinful. And I don't disagree with that, because my mind goes there quite a bit too, of recognizing our brokenness and finding gratitude, and that God chooses us anyway. But remembering, I think perhaps to a fault, sometimes, again, in our Lutheran theology, we go there first. We start from a place of brokenness. And I wonder at times if that is a mistake. And we need to remember that in the creation, in the story we're given of creation, clear back in Genesis 1, we start from a place of God calling good. We start from a place of delight from God. So that the beginning of our existence is good. And that's chapter 1. And it's not till chapter 3 that we have the fall, that we have the entrance of sin. So yes, we are broken. We don't deny that. But we start from a place that's good. And that God chooses to act within that which is broken and flawed and finite, to bring about this new thing that's going on in the resurrection. Now, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that in terms of a sermon, because that, as I'm even sitting here listening to myself say this, it sounds like it's a one heck of a deep theology paper, and I don't know how exactly to make that into a sermon that proclaims the good news. So I'm still working on that in my head, but that's a direction that my mind goes as I think about this, as I think about the reality that this has happened within flesh and blood. This has happened within a living person and a dead person who's now living again. And that's mind blowing, unexpected to say the least, and yet they've witnessed it. And so what are they going to do? They're going to go out and talk about it. And Luke being connected to the book of Acts, written by the same person, is certainly important, because we see that take action in this transition. Now, this is the end of Luke's gospel. There's only a few verses after this that actually talk about the ascension, that after this, he leads the disciples out to Bethany, which is a village just like 2 miles away from Jerusalem, and that's where the ascension occurs, and he's taken back to heaven. And then when Acts begins, it's pretty much a recap of that, that there's this post-resurrection period, and then Jesus returns to heaven, and that 10 days go by between the ascension and Pentecost. So that's the beginning of the book of Acts, when this takes shape, when what they have witnessed becomes their mission. That's what's happening here. There's a lot going on here. There's clearly a lot of different directions that I could go with this as I look at the clock and see I've been talking for 15 minutes about stuff. But that's where my brain's at right now. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw those down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.